7.3%. That was the simulated attrition rate recorded by No. 2 Squadron, Royal Air Force, during exercise Red Flag in 1977, their first invitation to the United States Air Force's premier air combat exercise at Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. The Americans had expected something closer to 30, maybe 40. What they got instead was a squadron of single-seat SEPECAT Jaguar G-R Mark 1s threading through defended airspace at heights that made the range safety officers physically uncomfortable. Colonel Robert Moose Henderson, Deputy Exercise Director at Nellis during that rotation, had watched dozens of foreign air forces cycle through Red Flag since its inception the previous year. The Luftwaffe sent Phantoms, the Australians brought Mirages. Everyone flew medium-altitude ingress profiles, popped up for target acquisition, delivered ordnance and climbed away. Standard NATO procedure. Predictable enough that the aggressor squadrons playing Soviet air defense could model interception windows with reasonable confidence. The British didn't do any of that. RAF Jaguar crews crossed the initial point at 250 feet above ground level, then descended. They pushed down to 100 feet indicated on the radar altimeter, occasionally lower, at 480 knots, 550 miles per hour across the Nevada desert floor. The simulated surface-to-air missile batteries calibrated to NATO standard medium-altitude attack profiles couldn't acquire them fast enough. The aggressor F-5s playing the interceptor role struggled to pick them out against ground clutter. Henderson reportedly told his staff that either the British were the bravest pilots he'd ever seen or the most reckless, and he wasn't yet sure which. None of this makes it into the usual highlight reels. If it matters to you and the fact you're still reading suggests it does, a like pushes this to more people who care about getting it right. Subscribe if you want the full story. Drop a comment if you've heard a different version, because the sources on Red Flag 77 are thinner than they should be. The distinction Henderson was groping for didn't actually exist. The RAF crews weren't brave in the cowboy sense, and they weren't reckless in any sense. They were executing a tactical doctrine that had been refined across 15 years of Cold War planning for a very specific scenario: the penetration of Soviet integrated air defense networks across the North German plain. Every aspect of it, the altitude, the speed, the route selection, the weapons delivery profiles, had been worked out against simulated Warsaw Pact defenses in exercises over West Germany, where the terrain was flatter, the weather was worse, and the consequences of getting it wrong at 100 feet were absolute. Nevada was actually easier. The visibility was better. The terrain had more contrast. The birds were smaller. What puzzled the Americans wasn't the flying itself. Their own F-111 crews did low-level work, though rarely as low and never quite as fast relative to aircraft size. The puzzle was doctrinal. Why had an entire air force organized itself around the assumption that medium altitude was death? Why? Because they'd done the maths. By the mid-1960s, NATO's intelligence picture of the Central European theatre had solidified into something that read less like a threat assessment and more like a suicide note. The group of Soviet forces in Germany, GSFG, maintained roughly 380,000 troops in East Germany alone. Behind them, the northern group of forces in Poland added another 40,000. Behind those, the western military districts of the Soviet Union held strategic reserves that could begin arriving at the inner German border within 72 hours of mobilization. The total force available for a westward offensive, according to a Ministry of Defense assessment circulated in 1967 and declassified decades later, exceeded 1.2 million men in the first echelon alone. The centerpiece was 3rd Shock Army, headquartered at Magdeburg. The name wasn't ceremonial. 3rd Shock Army had been constituted in 1943 specifically for breakthrough operations, the rupturing of prepared defensive lines through concentrated armored assault. By the 1970s, it fielded 4 tank divisions and 1 motor rifle division, operating approximately 1,300 main battle tanks and 600 artillery pieces, With its own organic air defense umbrella of SA-6 Gainful and SA-8 Gecko surface-to-air missile systems layered with ZSU-23-4 Schilke self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. Its designated axis of advance ran through the Fulda Gap and the North German Plain, aimed at the Channel ports. The air defense component alone should give you pause. A single Soviet motor rifle division on the march deployed an integrated belt of radar-guided and infrared missile systems extending from ground level to approximately 40,000 feet. Stack 3 or 4 divisions side by side on a breakthrough frontage of perhaps 60 kilometers, and the overlapping coverage created what NATO planners called, with characteristic understatement, a high-threat environment. An aircraft flying at 15,000 feet above this formation would be tracked by between 8 and 12 separate radar systems simultaneously. Time from detection to missile launch was estimated at 6 to 9 seconds for the SA-6 system. Time of flight for the missile to reach a medium-altitude target, another 8 seconds. A pilot flying straight and level at 15,000 feet over a Soviet armored column had perhaps 14 seconds to live from the moment his aircraft was painted by acquisition radar. Probably fewer because the SA-6 battalions practiced coordinated engagements. Wing Commander Peter Williamson, who commanded No. 54 Squadron at RAF Coltishall between 1974 and 1976, wrote in a post-retirement account for the RAF Historical Society that every pilot on his squadron understood the arithmetic with absolute clarity. Fly at medium altitude over the central front, and you were dead before you saw the missile that killed you. So the RAF went low. Not low in the American sense, where tactical aircraft might descend to 500 feet for a terminal attack run. Low in the sense that became uniquely, almost pathologically, British, a sustained transit altitude of 100 to 250 feet above ground level, maintained for the entire route from crossing the forward edge of battle area to weapons release and back. At that height, ground-based radar couldn't see you. The curvature of the earth and intervening terrain features, buildings, tree lines, hedgerows, even gentle folds in the North German landscape, broke the line of sight between aircraft and radar antenna. The SA-6, for all its lethality, needed several seconds of continuous radar track to generate a firing solution. An aircraft at 100 feet traveling at 480 knots was visible to any given radar for perhaps 2 to 4 seconds before terrain masked it again. The geometry simply didn't work for the Defender. The Schilke was a different problem. Its 423mm cannon could throw 3,400 rounds per minute into a cone of airspace directly above a Soviet column, and it didn't need much radar warning to be effective. But the Schilke's engagement envelope was small, effective range roughly 2,500 meters, and a Jaguar at 480 knots crossed that distance in roughly 10 seconds. The window was survivable, barely. The Ministry of Defense estimated that a properly flown low-level sortie against a defended target on the Central Front would face an attrition rate of between 4 and 8% per mission. At medium altitude, the same models produced figures north of 60%. 4% was grim. 60 was extinction. Group Captain David Bagshaw arrived at RAF Bruggen in January 1975, with orders to oversee something that had never been attempted at a single NATO installation: the concentration of 4 frontline strike squadrons operating the same aircraft type from one airfield 14 miles from the Dutch border and roughly 240 miles from the inner German border. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. If the balloon went up, the phrase everyone used because nobody wanted to say the real words, RAF Germany's Jaguar force needed to generate maximum sortie rates in the first 48 hours. Dispersal across multiple bases meant dispersed maintenance, dispersed ammunition stocks, dispersed command infrastructure. Concentration meant efficiency. It also meant that a single Soviet tactical nuclear weapon could eliminate a quarter of Britain's ground attack capability in continental Europe. a trade-off that looks reasonable in a planning document, and considerably less so when you're the one sleeping on the base. Number 14 Squadron converted first in June 1975. Number 17 Squadron followed in 1976. Number 20 Squadron and Number 31 Squadron completed the quartet by 1977. 4 squadrons, roughly 60 aircraft. Each squadron assigned a specific slice of the target set across the central front. Bridges, marshalling yards, fuel depots, command posts, the choke points through which Third Shock Army's armour would have to pass. Bagshaw drove the hardened aircraft shelter program with an urgency that irritated the construction contractors and delighted the station's engineering wing. The shelters were extraordinary structures, reinforced concrete arches capable of withstanding overpressure from a near miss by conventional munitions, each housing a single Jaguar behind blast doors weighing several tons. 72 shelters eventually dotted the Bruggen landscape, dispersed across the airfield in a pattern designed to ensure that no single conventional strike could destroy more than 2 or 3 aircraft simultaneously. The shelters had their own electrical connections, their own compressed air supplies for engine starting. A pilot could be scrambled, strapped in, engines running and taxiing within minutes of the alert siren without ever exposing his aircraft to the open apron. Squadron leader Michael Stevens, who served as a flight commander on Number 17 Squadron during the conversion period, would be killed in a mid-air collision during a training exercise over the Otterburn Range in Northumberland in 1979. An accident unrelated to the low-level mission but grimly illustrative of the risks inherent in flying fast jets at the edge of the envelope even in peacetime. His replacement inherited a flight that was, by that point, already operating at a tempo that peacetime RAF stations in Britain could barely comprehend. Daily life at Bruggen demanded something specific of its pilots. The training schedule was relentless. Each pilot flew a minimum of 4 low-level sorties per week over the designated training areas in West Germany, the Netherlands, and occasionally Denmark. The routes were planned to simulate actual wartime ingress profiles, following river valleys, threading between known simulated SAM sites, timing the run to arrive over the target within a 30-second window. Navigation was done with map, stopwatch, and the Jaguar's inertial navigation system, which was accurate to about 1.8 nautical miles per hour of flight. After 90 minutes at low level, that drift could put you nearly 3 miles from where you thought you were. Pilots learned to cross-reference constantly. A church spire here, a motorway junction there, the distinctive bend in a canal that confirmed you were 4 seconds ahead of schedule, the cooling towers of a power station that told you it was time to turn. The German civilians who lived beneath these routes had opinions about the arrangement. Compensation claims for broken windows, startled livestock, cracked roof tiles and rattled nerves formed a steady, administrative burden that the station adjutant processed with the weary resignation of a man who knew the complaints were entirely justified and entirely beside the point. RAF Bruggen existed for one purpose. Everything else was secondary. At 480 knots, a pilot covered 8 miles every minute. 8 miles of terrain to read, obstacles to avoid, navigation to update, fuel to monitor, threat awareness to maintain, all while the altimeter needle hovered at 100 feet and the ground rushed past in a blur of green and brown and grey that offered roughly 0.75 seconds of reaction time if something went wrong. The Jaguar's cockpit looked from the outside like a relic. Single seat, conventional dials, no fancy multifunction displays of the kind the Americans were fitting to their newer types. No head-up display symbology worth mentioning. The outside lied. Buried inside that angular workmanlike airframe was the Marconi Elliott navigation and weapon aiming subsystem, NAVWAS, and it was in 1975 one of the most advanced digital computing systems fitted to any tactical aircraft in NATO service. The Americans had better avionics in their F-111s and A-6 Intruders, certainly. But those were twin-seat aircraft with dedicated navigators handling the sensor workload. The Jaguar pilot did everything alone. and Navwas was the reason he could. The system accepted up to 9 waypoints programmed before flight. It fused inputs from the inertial navigation platform, air data computer, and, crucially, a Ferranti Type 105 laser rangefinder and marked target seeker mounted in the aircraft's nose. The laser unit could do two things that mattered enormously at low level. First, it could range to a known ground feature, a bridge abutment, a distinctive building, and the computer would use that range, combined with aircraft heading and altitude, to update the inertial platform's position fix. This was how pilots corrected the 1.8 nautical mile per hour drift mentioned earlier. One good laser range to a known point, and the system snapped back to accuracy measured in tens of meters. Second, the laser seeker could detect reflected energy from a ground designator operated by a forward air controller, allowing the pilot to find a target he couldn't yet see with his own eyes. Then there was the projected map display, a transparency of the route map, prepared by the squadron's intelligence section before each sortie, was loaded into a unit beneath the instrument panel. The system projected this map onto a screen with a fixed aircraft symbol at the center, scrolling the map beneath it in real time based on Navwas position data. The pilot looked down and saw himself moving across the landscape. GPS did not exist. Moving map displays were not standard in any cockpit. Glass cockpits had not been fitted to a single tactical aircraft anywhere. Yet RAF Jaguar pilots had a continuously updated picture of where they were relative to their planned route, their target, and the known threat locations marked on the film. A detail that goes nowhere but seems worth recording. The map transparencies were produced by hand at each squadron's intelligence section using specialized photographic equipment, and the airmen responsible for this work were considered so essential that they were among the first personnel scheduled for evacuation to hardened facilities during a base attack. Their skill set was irreplaceable. The aircraft were not. The Jaguar looked like a simple aeroplane built for a simple job. The navigation suite said otherwise. This was a single-pilot precision strike platform designed to find a specific bridge at a specific time in weather that would ground most air forces, at an altitude where the margin between success and a crater was measured in feet. So why 100 feet? Why not 50, which would have been even harder to detect? Why not 200, which would have been considerably less likely to kill you? The answer came from a classified RAF Institute of Aviation Medicine study conducted at Farnborough in 1973, using data gathered from hundreds of low-level training sorties flown by operational pilots. Below 75 feet, the human visual system began to fail at the task. Peripheral vision, the mechanism by which a pilot sensed his height above ground without consciously looking at the altimeter, degraded rapidly as the terrain filled more and more of the canopy. Pilots reported a narrowing of attention, a funneling of focus onto the ground immediately ahead, which meant they stopped scanning for threats and stopped checking navigation, stopped doing everything except trying not to die in the next half second. The study's authors used the phrase progressive task saturation, and the data showed it became acute below 75 feet at speeds above 400 knots. Controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, the antiseptic acronym for flying into the ground, accounted for more fast jet losses in RAF Germany during the 1970s than any other single cause. Above 250 feet, the mathematics reversed. Soviet radar systems of the era, particularly the P-15 flat-face acquisition radar, organic to SA-6 batteries, could detect a fighter-sized target at 250 feet above flat terrain at ranges of approximately 15 to 20 kilometers. At 100 feet over the same terrain, detection range collapsed to between 3 and 6 kilometers, often less if there were trees or buildings in the radar's line of sight. The difference between 6 kilometers and 20 kilometers of warning was the difference between a snapshot and a properly guided engagement. At 480 knots, an aircraft covered 6 kilometers in approximately 45 seconds. A Soviet battery needed a minimum of 12 to 15 seconds for detection, track initiation, missile launch and time of flight. 45 seconds minus 15 left 30 seconds of exposure before the aircraft passed behind terrain again, or flew out of the engagement envelope entirely. Tight but survivable. At 20 kilometers of detection range, that same battery had over 2 minutes of tracking time. Multiple missiles, coordinated engagements with adjacent batteries. The pilot probably never saw the airfield again. 100 feet was where the curves crossed, where radar detection range dropped below the threshold needed for reliable engagement, while the pilot's cognitive and physiological capacity remained just adequate for sustained flight. The RAF hadn't chosen the altitude through institutional bravado. They'd found it through flight testing, operational analysis, and the accumulated evidence of pilots who had pushed lower and not come back. The physical toll was extraordinary. A sortie lasting 90 minutes at 100 feet produced fatigue equivalent to several hours of normal flying, according to the Farnborough study. Heart rates recorded from instrumented pilots averaged 155 beats per minute during the low-level phase, comparable to sustained sprinting. Sweat soaked through flight suits and neck muscles cramped from the constant small head movements required to cross-check instruments, terrain, map display, and the world outside the canopy in a cycle that repeated every few seconds without pause. Pilots described the sensation as drinking from a fire hose, too much information arriving too fast, all of it urgent, none of it deferrable. And the weather made it worse. The North German plain in winter offered visibility that could drop to 2 kilometers in haze, rain, or low stratus. The terrain was flat, relentlessly, unhelpfully flat, which sounds like it should make low-level flight easier. The opposite was true. Over hilly terrain, a pilot had constant visual references, ridgelines, valleys, slopes that gave depth perception something to work with. Over the plains of Lower Saxony, the world became a featureless wash of grey-green fields, stretching to a horizon that merged imperceptibly with an overcast sky. Height judgment suffered, and spatial orientation wavered with it. The radio altimeter became the only reliable reference, and pilots learned to trust the needle with a faith that bordered on religious. Between 1971 and 1985, RAF Germany lost 37 Jaguars to accidents. Mechanical failures, bird strikes, mid-air collisions during formation maneuvers. These all contributed. But the single largest category was controlled flight into terrain during low-level operations. The price of hiding from Soviet radar was paid in peacetime, in training, over friendly fields. Flight Lieutenant Peter Collins, a weapons instructor on No. 20 Squadron, spent the better part of 1978 teaching new pilots how to kill a bridge. The method depended entirely on what hung beneath the wings. The standard conventional load was 2 1,000-pound retard bombs, each fitted with a ballistic tail unit that deployed on release. A metal petal arrangement that bloomed open and dramatically increased drag, slowing the weapon's forward travel so the aircraft could escape its own blast fragmentation. Without the retard tail, a 1,000-pound bomb released at 100 feet and 480 knots would impact the ground roughly 3/4 of a mile ahead of the release point. The aircraft would still be within the fragmentation envelope. The retard tail bought distance. Enough distance that the pilot wasn't killing himself, along with the target. Delivery was a shallow toss maneuver, a brief 4G pull-up from low level, weapon release at a computed point during the climb, then an immediate hard turn back down to the deck. Total time above 100 feet was between 8 and 12 seconds. Every one of those seconds was a gift to any SAM operator watching. The BL-755 cluster munition changed the geometry. Designed by Hunting Engineering and carried in a canister roughly the size and shape of a standard 1,000-pound bomb body, it dispensed 147 armor-piercing submunitions across an area approximately the size of a football pitch. Against soft-skinned vehicles, fuel dumps, parked aircraft, and exposed infantry, the BL-755 was devastating. Against a bridge, it was useless. Mission planning started with the target and worked backwards to the weapon, never the reverse. Then there was the one nobody discussed at dinner parties, The WE-177A was a tactical nuclear weapon with a yield variously reported as between a fraction of a kiloton and 10 kilotons. The exact figure remains classified, and sources conflict on where, within that range, the most common setting sat. Laydown delivery meant exactly what the word suggested. The pilot flew at 100 feet, released the weapon, and a retard parachute deployed to slow its descent while the aircraft ran. A timer fused the detonation. The pilot had approximately 90 seconds to put as much distance as possible between himself and the burst point, flying away at maximum speed in a pre-planned escape heading designed to exploit terrain masking from the thermal pulse and blast wave. Ministry of Defense planning documents from the period, declassified in 2003, estimated the probability of aircrew survival following a successful WE-177 laydown delivery at roughly 50%. The pilots knew the odds, and none of that knowledge changed the training schedule. RAF Bruggen's hardened mission planning facility sat beneath 8 feet of reinforced concrete, accessible through blast doors that required 2 separate keys held by 2 separate officers. Inside, the air tasted of recycled dust and stale coffee, and the walls were lined with maps at scales most civilians never encountered, 1 to 50,000, 1 to 250,000, each covered in acetate overlays marked with colored grease pencil in a notation system that had barely changed since Bomber Command. A nuclear strike mission began not with the pilot but with a target folder. Each folder was pre-prepared, updated quarterly, and stored in a safe rated to withstand temperatures that would melt the building above it. The folder for a given target, say a railway marshalling yard 150 miles east of the inner German border, contained vertical and oblique reconnaissance photography, a terrain profile along the planned route, coordinates for each waypoint expressed to the nearest 10 meters, known and suspected air defense positions plotted along the ingress and egress tracks, and a time on target window specified down to the minute. The window mattered because the Jaguar strike was one element of the Single Integrated Operational Plan, SIOP, the vast interlocking American-led schedule that deconflicted every NATO nuclear delivery to prevent fratricide between weapons and aircraft and to keep the blinding electromagnetic effects of one detonation from interfering with the guidance systems of the next. A Jaguar arriving 30 seconds late didn't just miss its slot. It flew into the debris cloud or thermal environment of an adjacent strike. Route selection consumed most of the planning effort. The intelligence section maintained what they called a threat library, a continuously updated catalogue of every SA-6, SA-8 and ZSU-23-4 position identified by signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, or NATO-wide sharing. The route had to thread between these positions, exploiting terrain masking wherever the flat North German plain offered any at all. A river embankment here, a stretch of forest there, an industrial area whose buildings and chimneys would clutter a radar scope for the 4 or 5 seconds needed to cross the beam, a cutting along a rail line that dropped the aircraft below the horizon of a tracking radar for a few hundred meters. Each leg between waypoints was measured for distance, heading, and elapsed time, then checked against fuel consumption figures that left no room for improvisation. Fuel was the constraint that governed everything else. The Jaguar carried internal fuel for approximately 450 nautical miles at low level. With 2 underwing drop tanks fitted, each holding 264 gallons, that range extended to roughly 620 nautical miles under ideal conditions. Ideal conditions did not exist over the Central Front. Maneuvering to avoid threats burned fuel at rates well above the cruise tables. Headwinds in winter could eat 15% of range. The planning margin was 10% of total fuel, which sounds comfortable until you realize that 10% of 620 nautical miles gave you 62 miles of contingency across a 300-mile round trip into hostile airspace, where nothing would go according to plan. The drop tanks came off at a predetermined point during the ingress, jettisoned to reduce drag before the final run to the target. This was calculated to the mile. Too early, and the aircraft ran short on the egress. Too late, and the additional drag meant arriving outside the SIOP window. Squadron leader Michael Dent, who served as a mission planner on number 14 Squadron, later wrote that the fuel calculations felt like solving a puzzle where every variable was trying to kill you, and the penalty for an incorrect answer was thermonuclear. Pilots received their target folders during generation, the formal process of bringing the squadron from peacetime readiness to war footing. Each man studied his route, committed the waypoints to memory as a backup to Navwas, and walked through the terrain profile until he could close his eyes and describe the visual picture at each turning point. The WE-177 would be loaded by a specialist Royal Air Force armament team under armed guard, with authentication codes verified at each stage of the process. The entire mission, from takeoff to weapon release, was expected to last between 38 and 44 minutes. The return journey, if there was one, was the pilot's problem. The smell was avtur and sweat, and the rubberized lining of an oxygen mask pressed hard against the face. Beyond the canopy, the world at 100 feet was a streaming grey-green blur, the November overcast sitting at 300 feet like a lid, and somewhere ahead, 4 minutes ahead at 480 knots, the inner German border. The pilot crossed it without ceremony. No fence visible at this speed. A river perhaps, or a road junction that matched the memorized terrain profile, and then the Navwas display confirming what the stomach already knew. The air defense environment on the far side was not a wall. It was a web. The first layer belonged to the Shilka. The ZSU-23-4 was a tracked vehicle mounting 4 liquid-cooled 23mm cannon slaved to a gun-dish radar, capable of firing a combined 3,400 rounds per minute to an effective ceiling of roughly 1,500 meters. Soviet doctrine attached Shilka batteries directly to maneuver formations, tank regiments, motor rifle divisions, which meant they were everywhere the ground forces were, and by the time a Jaguar was 150 miles beyond the border, the ground forces were everywhere. The Shilka's radar had a detection range against a low-flying target of approximately 8 kilometers. At 100 feet, terrain clutter reduced this, but the Shilka crews also had eyes, and a Jaguar at 480 knots was not quiet. The sound arrived after the aircraft had passed. The visual signature, a dark cruciform shape hauling a faint trail of exhaust haze, arrived first, and a good crew could acquire, track, and open fire within 4 seconds of visual detection. 4 seconds. The aircraft covered 2.5 kilometers in that time. Above the Shilka layer sat the SA-6 Gainful, the system that had reshaped NATO doctrine after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Egyptian batteries destroyed dozens of Israeli aircraft in the opening hours. The SA-6's straight flush engagement radar could track targets at speeds up to Mach 2 and guide up to 3 missiles simultaneously. Its minimum engagement altitude was officially listed as 50 meters, roughly 164 feet. At 100 feet, the Jaguar was theoretically below the envelope. Theoretically. The word did a great deal of heavy lifting in mission planning documents. Wing Commander Jeffrey Brindle, who commanded No. 31 Squadron between 1980 and 1982, later wrote that no pilot he knew placed absolute faith in the SA-6's published minimum altitude. The figures came from intelligence estimates, not from anyone who had tested the proposition and survived to file a report. Then there were the fighters. MiG-23 floggers flying combat air patrols at medium altitude presented a paradox for the Jaguar pilot. The MiG's look-down, shoot-down radar, the Sapphire-23, was effective against targets above the ground clutter threshold, which varied with terrain. Over forest the threshold was higher, over flat, wet farmland in November it dropped. A Jaguar skimming the North German plain at 100 feet sat right at the boundary of what the Sapphire could resolve, and Soviet ground controllers directing the intercept faced the same ambiguity on their own scopes. The Jaguar carried no radar, no air-to-air missiles, and no radar warning receiver until the ARI 18223 was retrofitted in the early 1980s. And even then, it told the pilot he was being tracked without offering much in the way of suggestions about what to do next. The entire defensive strategy was absent. Don't be where they're looking. Beware. Don't climb or deviate. Fly the route, trust the planning, hold the altitude, deliver the weapon. 90 seconds later, if the mathematics held, a small thermonuclear sun would rise behind you. So could it actually hit anything? The planning, the fuel arithmetic, the terrain masking, threat avoidance, calculated acceptance of 50% survival odds. None of it mattered if the weapon missed. A WE-177 had a blast radius forgiving enough to compensate for modest delivery errors. A 1,000-pound retard bomb did not. And in the conventional role, the Jaguar's credibility as a strike platform rested entirely on whether a single pilot, flying at 100 feet in poor visibility, with no co-pilot and no automated weapon release, could put iron on target with enough consistency to justify the aircraft's existence. Number 14 Squadron set out to answer the question before anyone else at Bruggen had finished unpacking. The Salmon Trophy was Royal Air Force Germany's annual bombing and navigation competition, named after Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir John Salmond, and it carried weight far beyond the silver on the mantelpiece. Results were briefed to the air officer commanding. They appeared in annual reports that shaped procurement arguments, squadron assignments, and the careers of commanding officers. The competition measured both navigation accuracy, assessed against timed waypoint crossings, and weapons delivery, scored by missed distance from target center during live drops on the Nordhorn Range in Lower Saxony. Participating squadrons included Phantom and Buccaneer units alongside the Jaguar force, and the Phantom crews in particular had the advantage of a second pair of eyes in the back seat. A navigator whose sole job was to manage the weapon system, while the pilot flew the aircraft. The Jaguar pilot did both. 14 Squadron declared operational capability in June 1975, barely 5 months after arriving at Bruggen. Wing Commander Peter Thorne, the squadron's commanding officer, had driven his pilots through the workup with an intensity that raised eyebrows even by Cold War standards. The training records show sortie rates that exceeded the command average by nearly 20% during the conversion period. Thorne's view, expressed in the squadron's operational readiness report, was that proficiency in weapons delivery could not be separated from proficiency in low-level navigation. The two were the same skill viewed from different angles, and any training program that treated them as distinct was wasting time. The 1975 Salmon Trophy competition ran in October under conditions that might have been ordered specifically to humiliate fair-weather aviators. Cloudbase sat between 200 and 400 feet across the exercise area. Visibility dropped below 2 nautical miles for most of the afternoon detail. Several crews from other squadrons returned with incomplete scores after aborting weapon passes due to inadequate visual acquisition of the target. 14 Squadron's pilots completed every pass. Their average circular error, probable, the radius within which 50% of weapons landed, was tighter than any Phantom squadron competing that year. The Navwas-assisted delivery, combined with the shallow toss profile, the Jaguar's inherently stable low-speed handling at release altitudes, and the sheer repetition of Thorne's training regime, produced a consistency that surprised observers who had assumed a single-seat aircraft would be at a disadvantage. The squadron took the Salmon Trophy in its first year of operations. They won it again. By 1977, the pattern had become difficult to dismiss as luck or favorable conditions, and the other Bruggen squadrons, number 2, number 17, and number 20, were posting competitive scores that placed the Jaguar force collectively ahead of the 2-seat types across RAFG. The Nordhorn range scoring system used ground-mounted cameras, synchronized with radar tracking to produce missed-distance data, accurate to within approximately 2 meters. The scores were measurements, not estimates. The air staff had hoped for this during procurement but could not have guaranteed it. That NAVWAS, the Jaguar's airframe stability, and a properly trained single-seat pilot could match or exceed the delivery accuracy of larger, more complex aircraft carrying dedicated navigators. The weapons planning described in the previous sections was not theoretical. 14 Squadron had proved it worked in weather that grounded sensible people at altitudes where the margin between a trophy and a funeral was measured in single digits of feet. The hardened aircraft shelter smelled of hydraulic fluid and damp concrete, and the particular staleness that accumulates when air is circulated through filters designed to scrub out chemical agents. Strip lighting hummed at a frequency that burrowed into the back of the skull after the first hour, and stayed there for the remaining 23. 2 pilots per shift, 15-minute readiness. The Jaguar sat on the centerline of the shelter, armed, fueled, the WE-177 already fitted to the centerline pylon. Its green tamper seals checked every 4 hours by an armament technician who logged the inspection on a form that required 2 signatures. The cockpit canopy was left open. The pilot's immersion suit, life preserver, bone dome, and nav bag sat on the ejection seat in the order they would be donned. The sequence had been rehearsed until it was autonomic. Legs in, harness on, helmet, mask, strap, canopy, start 1, start 2, taxi. The crew room was a partitioned space at the rear of the shelter. Camp beds, a kettle, paperback novels that had been read so many times the spines were white. A telephone, red, that connected directly to the Air Defense Operations Center at RAF Bentley Priory. If it rang and the authentication codes matched, the war had started, and everything the pilot had known before that moment was already burning or about to burn. Flight Lieutenant James Harker served QRA tours with No. 17 Squadron between 1978 and 1981. He wrote afterward that the hardest part was not the fear, which was manageable, but the boredom that preceded it. Hours of absolute nothing punctuated by practice alerts that triggered the same adrenal response as the real thing, so that after a dozen false starts the body stopped distinguishing between exercise and extinction. The practice scrambles came without warning. A klaxon, then the red phone, then a voice reading an authentication code from a sealed card. The pilot had to match it against his own card before proceeding. If the codes matched, he ran. During exercises, the sequence terminated at engine start. The pilot sat in the cockpit, engines running, hands on the throttles, waiting for the stand-down call. Some exercises ran the sequence all the way to the threshold of the runway before cancellation. The Ministry of Defense wanted realistic response times. It got them. Average time from klaxon to both engines running was under 4 minutes across all 4 Brigand squadrons during the 1979 evaluation cycle. What nobody trained for, what could not be trained for, was the mental architecture of sitting at 15-minute readiness for a mission you would fly once, in one direction toward a target you had memorized in a country that would be trying to kill you, carrying a weapon whose successful delivery meant 250,000 people would die, and whose detonation you would feel as a white flash in your rearview mirrors if you were lucky enough to survive the egress. The target folder sat in the crew room's safe. A few pilots reviewed it during every shift, running the route and the timing until the numbers were worn smooth. The rest looked at it once and never opened it again. Both approaches were rational. The red phone in 17 years of Jaguar QRA at Bruggen never rang with a matched code. On the 14th of June 1984, at 11:47 a.m. local time, a Jaguar GR1 from No. 17 Squadron touched down at Bruggen following a routine low-level training sortie over the Eifel Hills. The pilot taxied to the hardened aircraft shelter, shut down both Ador engines and filled in his post-flight servicing form. It was the 50,000th Jaguar operational sortie flown from RAF Bruggen. Nobody held a ceremony. The Tornado GR1 had been selected as the Jaguar's replacement in the strike role back in 1979, though the transition took the better part of a decade to execute. Number 20 Squadron converted first in 1984. Number 17 followed in 1985. Number 2 Squadron re-equipped in 1986. And number 14, the squadron that had won the Salmon Trophy before most of its Tornado-era successors had finished officer training, flew its last Jaguar sortie from Bruggen in 1984 before relocating to RAF Wildenrath, and then disbanding in its strike role. The Tornado brought terrain-following radar, a dedicated navigator in the back seat, more range, a heavier weapons load, and the ability to fly at 200 feet in zero visibility without the pilot ever looking outside. It was, by every measurable criterion, a more capable aircraft. The Air Staff's own assessment, contained in a 1983 program review now held at Kew, noted that the Tornado's automated weapon delivery reduced circular error probable by approximately 40% compared to the Jaguar in equivalent conditions. The Jaguar force had spent 13 years compensating for automation it didn't have, using skill it couldn't afford to lose. 41 pilots were killed flying Jaguars in Royal Air Force service between 1973 and 1984. The majority died during low-level operations, controlled flight into terrain, bird strikes at high speed, disorientation in poor weather, mid-air structural failures. The standard causes recorded in the standard language of boards of inquiry that delivered their findings to families who received a visit, a letter, and eventually a pension adjustment. The Bruggen Jaguar force flew those 50,000-odd sorties across 13 years of operational service, maintaining nuclear QRA without interruption, winning the Salmon Trophy repeatedly, deploying to red flag and returning with attrition rates that rewrote American assumptions about survivability, and placing 4 squadrons of armed aircraft within 44 minutes flying time of targets inside East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. The Soviet Third Shock Army, the force most likely to lead any invasion of the North German plain, maintained its positions east of the border for the entire period. On the last day of Jaguar operations at Bruggen, a pilot from Number 2 Squadron signed out the aircraft's Form 700, walked across the wet tarmac to the crew room, and made a cup of tea.